Good afternoon, everybody. This is Nevin Gusak, your host of New Ideas. With me is one of my recurring guests and a good friend of the show, Dr. Pat Choate, who is an economist, accomplished author, former vice presidential candidate under Ross Perot in the 1996 election. He was a former VP of TRW. So Pat brings a wealth of knowledge when it comes to economics, geopolitics, politics in general, special interest, corruption, and has a lot of experience in the business world, the academic world, and the world of local, state, and federal government. How you doing today, Pat, and welcome back.
Thank you. It's great seeing you and good to be back. Thank you for the generous introduction.
You're welcome. Thank you for lending your time generously to the show once again. And continuing our collaboration for the sake of not only the show, but also the audience. So we all learn new ideas, no pun intended, from you and your wealth of knowledge. So Pat, what have you been up to? You've been telling me that you're doing some major research projects right now. Did you want to share anything with the audience?
Yes. What is happening is the Trump trade initiatives, his tariffs. They're getting a great deal of attention, but I think what people are missing is that what Trump has done is open the door for a broad range of discussions and changes about the global trade system and about the effects of the U.S. trade deficit in the United States. We're not really at that point, but it will happen as we get into it. So basically, I think that we've just ended a firm end to the era of globalization that was created by President George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton with NAFTA, with the World Trade Organization, China, ascension into the WTO as a developing nation, etc. And it is that era was based upon the United States trying to impose upon the world a global trade order that was based upon Anglo-American economics, a rules-based, free market, wide open, transparent, multilateral system. That system is effectively over. It had been slowly dying for 15 or 20 years. It went on to pause in 2017 when Trump stopped the operation of the dispute settlement mechanism. Biden continued it, and now it's over. So the question is then, what will be the new international trade order? The second is we finally got attention onto the United States goods trade deficit, which last year was $911 billion, up from $90 billion in 1990. 1,000% increase. And suddenly we turn around and what we find is that we're dependent on imports in this country on everything from toys and pencils and apparel and shoes to all of our medicines. We import 90% of our medicines, to most of the new tech energy, wind, air, etc., to the key materials that we use in our most advanced machines, the rare earths, the 17 rare earths. And what we turn and find that a major control of that system is by the Chinese, who have set out to weaponize the global supply systems for all key industries. What they are seeking, very explicitly, what they're seeking is to be totally independent of all others for the components that are necessary to run their economy, and at the same time make the rest of the world dependent upon them for key technologies necessary to run our economies. So I've been digging in, getting the numbers, tracking it out. Artificial intelligence is just wonderful in helping pull that together quickly and arraying it. And then you can go back and check the sources on it. But fundamentally, that is what's intriguing. We're at the beginning of a new international order of trade. This what we do in the next 4, 5, 6 years will define what we'll do for the rest of the 21st century.
Now, you mentioned something very important, and I hear this buzz because a lot of people are concerned about the potential cost and the hike in cost of goods, while families for decades have been financially under strain with the higher costs of goods and services, where wages are not keeping up rapidly. And unfortunately, I see the free trade advocates using this as an opportunity to push back against any kind of economic nationalism. And that concerns me because you outlined a huge problem right here. You've been in this fight for a very long time, God bless. I've been fighting this in my show and my writing, so have many other commentators, scholars, observers, politicians, business people, etc. Why are trade deficits so important? I cannot tell you how many times I've heard for years and years and years saying trade deficits don't matter. They're not the same as the national debt. Now, I look at trade deficits, and I want you to comment on the importance of trade deficits and why more your free trade economists say that they don't matter, and unpack that a little bit. I look at trade deficits as statistics of goods that we no longer produce, goods that we cannot produce, goods that we import, lost wealth. And I consider wealth 6 sources of national wealth for any country: manufacturing, mining, agriculture, education, research and development, and number 6 is infrastructure. That is the 6 sources of national wealth, according to what I've said. And it's not an entirely original thing, what I am saying, I know, but I've isolated it to those 6 things. Why do trade deficits matter? What are they to you? Let's unpack the reality of let's just call it BS of free trade economists.
Well, rather than getting into the theory, for me, what matters is the composition of the trade deficits. If you're dependent on imports, then you're dependent on the politics of another nation to have an influence over what your country does. If the goods that you're importing are essential for your way of life and for your production, you become dependent. As such, you become a satellite, in effect. This country, through the trade policies that were put into place after World War II, and particularly during the Bush and Clinton years, have made us dependent on a whole range of items that are essential to our economy. And the clearest example of this is the trade in advanced technology products. These are the 10 categories of goods that are the most advanced technologies in the world, a trade that the United States, really up until the late 1980s, dominated worldwide. And what we now find is ourselves in a position where we're heavily dependent on foreign produced sources. In many cases, they're American owned companies, but they're foreign based. The scientists, the workers, the production facilities are abroad. And the preponderance of that is now coming not just from China, but from the handful of countries around China, South Korea, Vietnam, Japan, etc., that are within the Chinese sphere of influence. Last year, that trade deficit was somewhere over $200 billion. Now, these are, in many cases, one-of-a-kind industries. It'll be a very narrow industry to produce a very specific part of the chips that are manufactured, for example, in artificial intelligence. If you control that manufacturer, you control the deployment of artificial intelligence. If you control artificial intelligence, you control literally the next generation of manufacturing. You control the next generation of military weapons, national security, etc. It is strategic domination of certain industries that are vital. And to me, that is the real issue. I am less concerned about the production of items such as shoes, for example. If we have access to shoes from a friendly nation, such as, let's say, Mexico, for example, where you have a concentrated shoe industry. But I would be very concerned about it if we were totally dependent upon China as such. It is an adversary. You know, the Chinese strategy has always been hide your strength. We're going to see this. We're going to see a demonstration of this in Trump's trade war with the Chinese. The Chinese have restricted the flow of rare earths, lithium, and materials such as that are essential to our electronics industry. The prices have tripled over the past month. The supplies have been cut off. And the Chinese are doing everything they can to make sure that it doesn't flow through other countries, transshipment of those goods. We're going to see industries close down in the United States as that works its way through. We're going to find the same thing on a whole series of other items that range anywhere from kitchen appliances to our televisions, our electronics. China, for example, could cut off the whole flow of smartphones into the United States. They're 70% are produced out of China as such, and most Apple is there, though they're starting to production in India. So to me, that's the importance of the trade deficit. Beyond that, it is a question of national wealth. Wealth is something that produces income and benefits for the owners of that wealth. So, do we wish to own the wealth that we produce in this country, or do we wish someone else to own that wealth? Today, others increasingly are owning that wealth. The other thing that comes to it is we buy abroad, as we borrow to pay for much of that, particularly out of our federal government. What we wound up with is other countries holding major amounts of our national debt. Our national debt is still overwhelmingly owned by the United States, but a major part of it is now held by others. The Japanese, as the last I looked, owned about 1.3 trillion. The Chinese have about 768 billion. The Chinese, for example, could dump 100 billion, let's say $100 billion into the treasury market. They would totally upset the U.S. bond market, which would just ripple through our economy like a sheath, destroying industries, housing industries, etc. Anyway, so my concern is the composition of it, particularly on the defense military industrial base. I mean, it's madness for us to depend on China for the materials and machinery we need to build our own national defense. Can you imagine what would have happened if we had depended upon Japan in 1940, 1941 to build the weapons for that war?
No, you brought up very good points. And the United States had or has trade deficits with either countries whose governments are totally at variance with our values or who are adversaries. Right. China, Russia, at least until President Biden and the Congress and the Senate put sanctions on Russia and basically a near embargo on them, we had massive trade deficits with the Russians since at least before President Obama granted them PNTR in 2012. Vietnam, which collaborates more with China than people like to realize, as well as other adversary governments, and also Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, I would not term them a particularly friendly country either, contrary to what might be stated, because their system, for starters, is totally at variance with Western democratic values and whatnot, and we have to take that into account when we're dependent on such countries and governments. And all those countries, governments, economies are state dominated. Even Saudi Arabia, with its more capitalistic sort of materialist veneer, there's still historically a tremendous amount of state participation in Saudi Arabia's economy, even with its privatization in recent years. Concerning the national debt, the Chinese and the Russians even held at one point a small part of our debt. In fact, when the later portion of President George W. Bush's term, the president, I believe it was Putin, got together with the Chinese communists and had actually wanted to collaborate on crashing the U.S. economy further by selling more of our debt. And of course, the Chinese overruled that for strategic, pragmatic reasons, not because they didn't have it in their hearts to do it. In fact, the Chinese PLA officers have written and stated publicly in their own publications, granted, that they would use our debt, to quote one back in 2007, as an atomic bomb against the American economy. And by the way, we traded with Japan while they were occupying and setting up puppet governments to their Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere up until 1940. I would argue that FDR has actually slow-walked the embargo against Japan. Now, did our trade with Japan during that time period lessen Japan's anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, militarism, and everything? No. And by the way, back then, Japan was also conducted dumping against Western countries, including the United States especially. Right. They were doing what was termed back then, the term, you probably remember this, social dumping. Right. And that the Japanese government, which dominated industry because it was controlled by fascists, they believed in an aggressive form of economic nationalism. So I think you're spot on. And history really proves you can't trust putting your economic destiny, or at least part of it, in the hands of an enemy country. Now, you mentioned the national debt. At one time, before President Reagan's administration, we were a net creditor nation. But by 1985, the Reagan administration, Mr. Patriotic, America First, Morning in America, in 1985, Reagan's administration announced we became a debtor nation. Now, my research indicates that it was because of the supply side tax policies that really led to that explosion. Can you unpack this a little bit? Am I wrong? What is the history of the national debt? How did we get here where we started to have gargantuan amounts of debt, whereas previous to Reagan, it was more minimal?
When Jimmy Carter left office on January the 20th, 1981, the national debt was a little less than $1 trillion. The country had existed quite literally for 205 years. It fought a civil war. It fought the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnamese War, and our total debt was less than $1 trillion. We were a pay-as-you-go country as such. The philosophy of the Reagan administration was supply side economics. And basically, they decided that if you would give massive tax cuts, that the monies would go for investment in production, and that would stimulate the economy, et cetera. Well, what it did is, in combination with a strong dollar, the philosophy of Wall Street at that point is a strong dollar represents a strong economy. What it did is it allowed others to take our strong dollar, play against it, and send imports into this country and have a competitive price advantage over domestic producers. And so the shift that occurred there was one in which we went from an economy based on production of goods, manufacturing, to a financial service dominated economy. At the same time, Reagan wanted, in the war with the Soviet Union, he used deficit financing to finance a major military buildup that, in effect, broke the Soviet Union and led to the breakup of the Soviet Union by the end of the 1980s. And at that point, you had Wall Street with great influence, a political system that allowed massive amounts of dark money to flow, the weakening of the two major political parties, and the rise of independent financing culminating in the Citizens United decision that gave the financial community extraordinary benefits, control, playing it out, what you now see, where Elon Musk was able to put almost 300 million into the campaign, take over key agencies, and wipe out the regulatory functions that affected his auto company and his SpaceX operation that has allowed us to go into cryptocurrency and crypto speculation. It allowed, after the out of the Clinton administration, the rise of derivatives, unregulated derivative trade, which soared from something like about 15 trillion in Clinton's last year to, I think it's something like $150 trillion. It shifted us to a speculative economy. So unbounded, unregulated financial system has been one of the results of this outcome. And it has created a collapse of the savings loan industry during the Reagan administration, major financial collapse. It led to the collapse of the financial system in the 2008 and 9 period, which cost the Federal Reserve $16 trillion to work our way out of that. And it left our economy highly vulnerable to a stock market system where speculation is favored over investment.
Yeah, and it also resulted, as you said earlier, from a pay-as-you-go tax system to a borrow and spend economy, and that led to the rise of Grover Norquist and Americans for Tax Reform and the other elements of the Koch brothers political network, which through Americans Prosperity, previously Freedom Works, and other organizations that have pushed this sort of supply side tax policy, which really in the long run really has not worked. It has not benefited, as Reagan initially promised, the productive capacity. And look, you and I are not for high taxes per se on investment, on productive investment, and even more traditional forms of finance. But what has happened is, as you said, there's been this shift where the preeminent economic engines are very speculative in this country. Crypto, more, shall we say, parasitic forms of investment. For example, private equity, which used to be known as leverage buyouts. Really, what good has that done for the economy? I mean, zero, zilch, none, except for a small group of individuals. When we take a look at the balance sheet, no pun intended, you take a look at what Eddie Lampert did to Sears, and he was an adamant admirer and follower of Ayn Rand. You take a look at what happened to Sunbeam. Remember Chainsaw Al Dunlop and what he did to Sunbeam back in the 1990s, which basically, what I compare private equity or leverage buyouts, as they're also known as, more or less, is basically chewing tobacco. You chew it, you get the benefit, the good taste. I've never tried it, so I'm just going by what I've heard. You get the good taste of it and everything. And then when it's outlived its usefulness, go pooh, and then that's it. You get rid of it. And that's what happens. They load up these companies with massive amounts of debt, and then they basically just dump them. And I'm simplifying, obviously, a very complex process. And essentially, they come out literally with a golden parachute, so to speak, and they escape fine. And they leave communities and they leave individuals, professionals, as well as blue collar workers left holding the bag, quite literally. And how can any leader, Democrat, Republican, President Trump, how can they reverse this process? Because the tools are in the toolbox. They're lying all over the place.
Right.
The issue is that other than a small group of senators and congressmen, mostly in the Democratic Party, unfortunately, nobody, even if they wanted to, nobody can really do anything about it because, as you said earlier, because of our completely warped campaign finance structure. The other part, and you've pointed this out, is the Republican Party, with a few exceptions, are paralyzed with this government is always the problem and is never the solution ideology. And that's reinforced a lot by so-called, and I call it so-called conservative propaganda, quite literally. Talk radio, the TV channels, the TV shows, whether it's a Glenn Beck or it used to be Rush Limbaugh when he was alive, and others who are just totally spew this extremely very libertarian, hands-off, they're the job creators, respect, total uncompromising respect of Wall Street, and this idea that any rule or regulation, even if it worked in past history, oh, that's just communism, or oh, that's against the Constitution. And I'm convinced that part of this, from my research and some of my limited political experience, is done on purpose to misinform a lot of conservative and Republican and libertarian voters. So people like you and I, we have the tools, we can articulate our positions well, we have some political allies, but it's basically, at this point, it is still like a pea versus a cantaloupe in a fight, in a size. So I think long term, I think the country can make a shift, but even in the long term, are we able to make a shift, or do you think history is going to carry us to a point where people might look to somebody like you, Pat, and say, let's say one of the Congress people or senators you collaborate with, well, maybe they'll become president or a governor and they'll invite you on in their cabinet, let's say, for example. Do you think it will get to that point? And what are some quick steps that we need to do to fix our tax situation, our tariff and trade issue? And how should Trump communicate this? Because he's doing a terrible job.
Well, I think two or three things. First of all, I'm 84, and so any future role I have would just be temporarily advisory to anyone. But there are others out there that are engaged in this work. But for them, I think the first is a context. Politics and national policy in this country happens in major shifts. I mean, major, almost glacial shifts as such. It happened with Teddy Roosevelt and his reaction to the Gilded Age. It happened with Franklin Roosevelt in response to the Great Depression, where he was able to put in progressive ideas, most of which had first been advanced by his cousin Teddy Roosevelt. It happened with Reagan in a reaction to the New Deal. And we're at a point right now where it's going to shift again because it must shift in this country. As for Trump, the issue I think has to be that what he is doing is not necessarily providing solutions, but is setting an agenda of things that we need to examine. He is also taking and filling in holes and cracks in the Constitution, as you're seeing with these various court orders. So much, I think we can view the Declaration of Independence as a statement of aspirations, and we can take the Constitution and say that's our operating manual for this country. And as an operating manual, it has been defined over the past almost 2.5 centuries by court decisions. It's the court decisions interpreting what the Constitution is, interpreting what the law is. Now, so much of that operating manual was based upon precedent and what had been acceptable and the way it's been done. And the expectations of the public officials. Well, what Trump has done is so much that is unprecedented. And so the question is it legal as such? Some of the things, unprecedented things he's done has been declared legal, and many have not. This is we're in an era of really a fermented change here. We've had over 200 decisions by federal courts defining the legality of things that Trump is doing. And so what we're doing, this is all part of a messy process of building a more perfect union. That's very positive in my view. In this, him opening up this trade debate is absolutely essential. He's got the right issue, though I disagree. I think he has the wrong answer to that issue.
Yes.
But now that the discussion is opened up, and since so many powerful interests are being affected, we're going to go through this deliberative and back and forth process well past his administration to figure out what that is. Now, in my mind's eye, there are several things. The first is a recognition is that the world no longer operates under Anglo-American economic concepts. That is about a quarter of the world's economy. You have a whole series of other economic systems. You have the Chinese system, which is state-sponsored global capitalism, where state owned it. You have the European system, which is heavily socially oriented, with regulation of private business to achieve certain ends. You have the Nordic model with Norway and Sweden. You have the Japanese model and Korean, etc. So the first thing is, how do we deal with the competition between economic systems in a global audience? We haven't figured that out. A thing that I think Trump will take on is the disruptive role of the value-added tax system and how it's been weaponized against the United States. This is the single largest trade distorting factor in global trade today. Every other country takes their VAT, which is an average of 15-16%, and they impose it on American imports. That's a de facto tariff. And they rebate the VAT on goods that are produced inside their country and exported to the United States. That's a 15 or 16% tax subsidy to their exports. So we've got to take that on. Second thing that we've got to take on is, how do state-owned enterprises compete with privately owned enterprises? It's how do we take on the Chinese model? Chinese model is very powerful. they've gone from like 2% of the world's manufacturing base in the late 70s to well over 40% right now. It's very dynamic. No private enterprise can compete against a Chinese state-owned corporation. They have the depth and wealth of the entire nation to pit against. When they decide that they're going to take over an industry, they're going to take it over unless our government or the European governments or other governments, in effect, deal with that. We don't have rules on how to deal with that. We haven't figured out how we're going to deal with it. We've got to deal with that, or the Chinese will totally dominate all that matters in that sense. The third issue that we've got to deal with is how do we deal with massive theft, global theft of intellectual properties. Our strength has always been that we can create. We've had the most productive, the best inventors in the world. Take a look at all the leading companies today. Their founders are still alive, and large. I mean, that is how fast technology can shift. But if you steal those ideas and they don't have an opportunity to really advance, or they're able to come in and just simply buy off the inventor and take it out, as happened so often with Google, Apple, Microsoft, and their monopolistic model of that. How do we deal with that? So, I mean, Trump has opened up a whole series of economic issues and questions here that have long been delayed. This is, in my mind's eye, this is going to be the singular most positive contributions his administration makes.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a great point, which, I have talked about as well, is probably one of the best Trump legacies is really opening up this issue of trade imbalances, trade with adversaries. It was always an issue, but certainly by the 2010s, it was very difficult. I was involved with the Coalition for a Prosperous America, and it was difficult to get the trade issue really in the fore of the political conversation. It was very difficult because free trade was an accepted orthodoxy, and that slowly got any protectionist sentiments were slowly pushed out of certainly Republican debates. I remember in the 2012 election, basically free trade was accepted as the dominant orthodoxy. I mean, there was some mild criticisms from Romney and Santorum, but it was really tiptoed, chipping around the edges. And I really didn't take Romney's concerns about China too seriously. I don't think he was sincere entirely about that or would have done anything about it if he became elected president. But Trump, whether we like him or not, whether he lived up to his rhetoric in his business practices, he always verbally criticized our free trade agreements and even aspects of Reaganomics too as well, as insofar as taking on foreign debt. He criticized that before Congress in 1991 in an exchange with Congresswoman Helen Dalich of Maryland. He also was very critical of free trade and aspects of Reaganomics in a appearance on the Oprah Winfrey Show, I believe in 1987 or 1988. So we always had these issues, whatever his motivations for speaking out about these issues, he at least aggressively brought it out, God bless you, into the national conversation. And that is very, very important because President Biden, to his credit, kept a number of Trump's first-term tariffs and export controls. And that's a good thing. And that's a good legacy. I think, and Trump has some arguably good people, at least with good academic or activist backgrounds, like Peter Navarro, irrespective of what his latest media appearances and statements. he still is a solid historian and economist, as you said. If you look at his written works and his work previous to the Trump administrations, you even have Michael Stumo, who was appointed, I forget the exact title of his position, but he's going to be in charge of Buy America provisioning, essentially. And he's working in the department in OMB, I believe, in the Office of Management and Budget. So my last question to you before we wrap up, is anybody whispering in Trump's ear about the importance of having a VAT instead of a traditional tariff?
Well, he did a study, had a study done. Peter Navarro and Wilbur Ross did a study in the first administration. Trump, the effects of the VAT are well known by Trump. What he has not come up with is a way and means to deal with the issue. Pardon me. Here in Tucson, it's the desert plants are a menace right now.
They're in full bloom.
Oh my goodness, yes they are. But that can be solved. I think when we get through with this current round of tariffs and discussion, this is going to, taking on the VAT is going to wind up being a preferred way of dealing with this issue. And it's very simple. All you've got to do is unilaterally say we're going to have a VAT reciprocity agreement. Is that if a foreign country can use the VAT to raise their own domestic revenues, and it's a great source of revenue creation or raising or collection, but you cannot weaponize it. You cannot rebate the VAT on goods that are exported to the United States. You can't do a subsidy. And secondly, you cannot charge a VAT, use it as a de facto tariff on U.S. imports coming in. Now, it's very simple. There are no difficulties calculating what the tariff rate will be. It's exactly equal to the country's applied VAT. It is no exceptions because it applies basically in most countries across the board. It is easy to explain. It's a subsidy and a tariff. We wanted eliminated against American. We wanted disarmed against American trade, and it's left to the initiative of other countries. No negotiations are really required here. Eliminate the VAT, and the offsetting tariff in the U.S. disappears correspondingly. So I think that I think we'll see that emerge. I think we'll see that emerge on the VAT. And yes, Trump has had some very good economic advisors as we've gone through this period.
Yeah, he has some good economic advisors on the trade front. He has a lot of people that are, of course, concerning, like, you know, his first administration, he had Larry Kudlow, he had Stephen Mnuchin, and continues to lean on people like Stephen Moore, who's basically a creature of Conservative Incorporated. He's the poster child, if you will.
Right.
You know, and to me, of course, this is the problem when also you're in the Republican Party. These people are kind of like barnacles on the bottom of a boat. They're hard to get rid of. There's a tremendous amount of money and influence and legacy. And, you know, that's going to be a challenge of the Trump administration because he is surrounded by Heritage Foundation people. You look at Kevin Roberts, you look at the head of OMB. So this is an uphill battle. And, you know, I guess, look, it's easier for me to be an armchair quarterback and say, well, he should do this and she should do that. It's a very difficult position for any president. But in reality, when you're coming into politics, you have a lot of money in media. you also have to have with all due respect, you have to have a good lay of the political land, because when you bring in people like a Stephen Moore or Larry Kudlow or an Elon Musk and others who are generally who are hostile to any form of economic nationalism or New Deal type of reforms of capitalism, they're going to sabotage you. And Peter Navarro wrote a book, actually, one of several books, and one dealt with, particularly during the COVID era, how there was a tremendous amount of sabotage of the Buy American laws, COVID stimulus, which was limited compared to other developing countries, limited as far as what average people like us receive, if at all, and things of that nature. So moving in the future, and I know I'm thinking perhaps in unrealistic terms, you really have to have almost this third political force or this new paradigm in both parties, which really just buries this sort of Milton Friedman, Stephen Moore, Larry Kudlow, greed is good, Wall Street is great, let the casino capitalist economy just keep on humming along, anti-unions, and a lot of poor shaming too as well. There's a tremendous amount of callousness, and it doesn't do the conservative movement and the Republican Party any favors. And the left here is taking advantage of it, and quite rightly, I might add, even though I'm not a leftist. So I think the conservatives need to really have a larger conversation, which is occurring. Maybe it's not going fast enough, the great purge, if you will, but I think a lot of the Reaganomics crowd, look, they have their right to say what they want, to publish. I'm a librarian by profession, freedom of speech in that way to convey ideas. I'm very stubborn about that. But they need to be pushed out of all the major political parties. They have really screwed up things royally. Their economic models as regard as human welfare, quality of life, has been an unmitigated disaster. It really, by first world standards. And it's time to turn the page on them. And it's time to just, I hate to sound rude, but kick them out. Kick them the hell out already. It's like enough is enough. 40 some odd years is enough. So that would be my solution. I think once the campaign finance and lobbying situation is repaired, I think that's the first thing I would do. If I were king of the United States for the day, dictator of the United States for the day, and could do what I want, I would take a chopping block to lobbying and campaign finance, and I would do some really strong reforms without going into details for the limitations of time that we have. So, that would be my response. And I think in the immediate sense, I think Trump needs to do a better job communicating in fireside chats, FDR style, what led us to the problem. Here are my solutions. Here is why I'm doing this. Have his spokespeople do it in a more effective manner and just kind of go from there. Because right now I see this administration, it's just one scandal after another, corruption. You have DOJ's heavy-handedness shrouded by secrecy and prosecutors to whistleblowers. The administration is giving a whiff of a very interesting and disturbing phenomenon. And no, it's not fascism, it's corporate authoritarianism, and that deeply concerns me for a number of reasons. And we could discuss that and dig into it more in the next show if you'd like, you and I, and unpack that. Pat, did you have any concluding remarks, and where can people find your works?
You can go to the internet. A lot of my works are published. You can find them there. Or you can go to Amazon, and I always recommend buy the used books. But spend $1 or $2 instead of $18 or $20 for the books. It's the ideas that count. My thoughts are this: I am really optimistic right now where we are as I see this thing playing itself out. We're going to have to go through a lot of pain. We're going to go through a lot of pain. And so the question is to do that in a way where we learn something. I am very pleased that the Democrats find themselves with a bare intellectual cupboard, literally, at this point. They have some basic ideas about democracy and the social welfare, et cetera, that are foundations. But on what to do and how to get there, they really don't have anything. They've been consumed by the neoliberal free trade agenda. And so they really, at this point, don't have a great deal to offer there. And as far as the conservative side, they were taken over years ago by the Koch brothers and a series of others that have put money into these think tanks. And so they have these hirelings that are there to go in and out of administration and work on things like Project 2025. But they're really offering nothing new. They're offering, in effect, a very stark, old-style libertarian, cut it to the bone. Government is the problem, not the solution agenda as such. I think we're going to have a very hard recession. So that is going to wake some people up and get them out of dogma and cults. It will break apart a good part of the Trump cult, and it'll certainly make the independent vote up for grab. It'll also motivate the Democrats. The next thing I think is going to be important is we're finally going to understand the rivalry that we have with China. We're going to understand that we're facing a country that is a superpower already, and that we're greatly dependent upon them for things on which we should not be dependent. And the challenge is going to be for these free trade ideologues is, can the free trade model compete with the Chinese model? Well, for 20 years, it is not. It has fallen behind. And so the question to them, are you willing to accept dependency, the risk to our national security, to being a second tier country, or are you willing to change to meet the challenge that is not going to go away in the rest of the lifetimes of everyone that's listening to this podcast today? So in that sense, this is going to be a time for ideas coming up. We're going to need new ideas. We're going to need new ways of doing it. The old ways are not working. And so it's going to be very exciting.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there's going to be new ideas coming to the fore, a lot of which was tested in other countries and here in the U.S. And I think ultimately I'm cautiously optimistic over the long term. I think America does have a lot of good minds where hopefully they'll prevail. But the question is are we going to be able to beat out hostile foreign powers, their influence, the influence of anti-capitalist extremism, which is understandably gaining ground, but very hostile to their long-term vision, obviously. And then also to so-called quote-unquote conservative or quote-unquote libertarians who just want to cut everything to the bone at the behest of their donors or just because of ideological tribalism. And I think that's where we have to have a sort of old school centrism, what used to be called the vital center or the radical center. And fortunately, there are people around that are all generations that are propounding these ideas.
Yeah. Well, what now happens is the Democrats have to come up with some standard bearers that can engage the debate against the conservatives that are now represented through the Trump administration. And if they win that debate, then the Republicans are going to have to get beyond something of neoliberalism.
Yep. Sounds good. All good stuff, Pat. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure having you.
Okay.
And we will be tuning in to you shortly for another round of interviews on topics. I mean, there's no shortage of topics these days.
Oh my God. No. I look forward
Me too.
Take care.
Everyone, happy Mother's Day. Thank you all for the great mothers, stepmothers. I have a very good stepmother. Shout out to my stepmom, Royce, and good grandmothers, sisters, and aunts, and whoever that are mothers. Happy Mother's Day, everyone. You all do a great job. Thank you very much. God bless. God bless America, and stay safe.